Welcome to part 3 of To the Moon and Black. And I'd like to get straight into this due to recent events since the previous episode. And that is none other than looking at the death of Rayshard Brooks, who was shot and killed by police in Wendy's car park last week, Friday. We saw the shocking footage that was recorded. And whilst one officer was sacked, again, similar to what we saw with George Floyd a few weeks prior, but he hasn't been charged as yet. And while we await for justice to be established with that particular individual as well, this pattern is too frequent. We discovered that a few weeks ago, 2 individuals were hung in public areas. They live 15 minutes apart from each other, and they were hung within 10 days of each other. They didn't know each other, to our recollection, but the autopsies were quick to rush out verdicts that they'd committed suicide. But understandably and unsurprisingly, their families have rejected that, as should we. These individuals, so we know their names, were Robert Fuller and Malcolm Harsh. And then only yesterday, we were watching news footage of 2 young teenagers, 13 and 14 respectively, walking home and being apprehended by the police for jaywalking. And one of them was treated so violently that it's traumatized him, according to his mum in subsequent interviews. So it is clear, as I've mentioned in previous videos, that this is Black Lives Platter, open season. Take your pick for these police officers, for the law enforcement in the US. And while we're speaking of a minority, it is a significant minority that are behaving within a framework and structure that enables them to meter out such violence and brutality to Black people. And we have to ask ourselves, why would they continue to be doing something like this in spite of the worldwide condemnation and protests, mass marches, and unfortunately on some occasions looting and rioting, which we do not justify the latter? You would think that law enforcement would be walking on eggshells. You would think that they would be taking extra precautions to not maltreat, mistreat anyone, Black or white. But in contrast to the treatment that we see happening very recently with Black individuals, young and older, we see also a video emerge on Facebook today of a white individual called Jerry. And Jerry gets apprehended by 2 police officers in America, a male and a female, and he overpowers them. And in the process of doing so, and this Jerry's quite an old individual, or let's say in his late 30s, 40s, but he's definitely overweight. And he manages to overpower these 2 officers, extract the baton from one of them, and beat both officers with the baton before taking one of the sheriff vehicles, locking the door and driving off. And at no stage in this short footage did we see either officer reach for their gun or stun gun to stop Jerry in his tracks. So the quick fire approach and attitude that they have with us is in stark contrast to the restraint that they show with white suspects who they're attempting to apprehend. And we need to ask ourselves a question as to why there's such a stark contrast. And Professor Kehinde Andrews, in his monumental book, Back to Black, he highlights something that he describes as the psychosis of whiteness. And I will read from his book today, alongside other aspects of research that I've done for this particular episode. And Professor Kendi says here that on a socio-economic level, whiteness is actually rooted in the political economy. It is in the fabric of the institution and social life. You cannot work the natives of America to death without whiteness. You do not enslave millions of African people and kill millions more without whiteness. You do not steal resources from the places of the world you have underdeveloped and then create a system of unfair trade practices without whiteness. The modern world has shaped the image of whiteness. Then let's move to the image of whiteness in a tangible form by way of the statues that are causing such dissension across various Western societies today. We witnessed white Britain attend London to stand guard around the statue of Winston Churchill, who is held as a hero amongst most Britons because of the feats against Hitler in World War II. And while acknowledging that, there's a gross failure to acknowledge his racist, bigoted beliefs and actions. The mass starvation of thousands in India at a particular time. His beliefs, his professed beliefs, espousing racist views. And there were other actions, but we're not going to go into that today. Then you had in Belgium, the controversy surrounding King Leopold, who has his statues up, and the barbarism and the deaths that were meted out to millions in Africa, in the Congo. Then we had the few standing by Gandhi. Gandhi's racist views and allegations of paedophilia while he was in South Africa are well accounted and documented. So these historic figures, who are heroes to some, are known in other societies and quarters as tyrants and villains, to say the least. And so this debate has emerged. We know that it started last year and previous to that with the Confederate statues in America, Charlottesville and the like. So these tangible images are even causing a problem. But what we see is that the passion and the vehemence behind standing up for these statues has not been seen when it comes to representing and standing up for a human, a black human, killed barbarically. So these statues have more in import and weight with one segment of society, white society, a significant segment, than black lives. Statues matter, black lives don't. What are the overarching concerns that we see from white society? And I touched upon that and made reference to it last week, and I will continue to do so today from a systemic and structural aspect. And we see here again from Professor Andrews, if white people were to acknowledge their role in the world, the blood and destruction upon which their liberty was built, then the whole system would come tumbling down. So whiteness becomes ingrained in not only the political economy, but also intellectual ideas. The Enlightenment provides the knowledge necessary for science and progress in Europe, while at the same time cementing the hierarchy of whiteness into how we understand the world. Whiteness is in the DNA of the social system. Therefore, overcoming whiteness is impossible because it is a product of the social condition, a psychosis caused to ensure the system remains intact. There is no reasoning with a psychosis, just as there is no point in engaging in a rational debate with whiteness. So we need to consider that when there are discussions and discourses about engaging about whiteness, or we feel about societal changes, we are in essence talking about whiteness. And when talking about whiteness, we're talking about a psychosis that exists amongst white society. And as we shall see very shortly, it has affected certain elements of black society as well. And that brings us on to the next stage, the lack of self-awareness, black unconsciousness from our part. And what do I mean by that? Again, reading. We are voluntarily commodifying ourselves by fitting into the areas, the parameters that this society, these societies have partitioned for us, have allocated for us. So we move into those and commodify ourselves into those particular segments of society. That voluntary commodification was not the case with our ancestors, our forefathers, who were forced into commodification with blackness and then sold and transported, and the rest is history as we know. So they had it enforced upon them, and some of us are voluntarily commodifying ourselves. Let's look at what this is. From Professor Andrews. With the commodification of black cultural forms, you could argue that the process continues of exploiting raw materials, this time cultural, to be sold to the black communities. And also, many of us have integrated to the point where we comfortably benefit from the fruits of imperialism. So we are also not immune. We are also not immune, to the psychosis of whiteness, because we're benefiting. We've integrated to that extent where imperialism is enabling us to eat from the table, the scraps from the table, mind you. They might be very tasty scraps, but they're still scraps all the same. So we are also not immune to the psychosis of whiteness. There are many black members of the Conservative Party, black entertainers getting rich, living up to racial stereotypes. And I'm not speaking against integration, but what I am asking is on whose terms? On what terms? And we need to look today. Many of us are successful in sports. Many of us are successful in entertainment. Very little is known or lauded within our own communities, with the exception of African communities at that, and wider society with regards to doctors, scientists, inventors, engineers. Very, very little is highlighted in those realms, because that is the arena for whiteness. And South Asians may have entered into that and are being acknowledged and recognized to a wider extent than black communities. Let's look at some of the stereotypes and nihilism that leads to denigration of self. So I want to ask this question: which ethnicity, which community or race, for want of a better phrase, denigrates its women in the same way that the black communities do? And we only have to listen to the nihilistic music, gangster rap and the like, which again is being placed into a segment of society for individuals to move into and fill and make finances, as long as they're denigrating women, as long as they're calling to violence, and I'll come to that as well. Which communities, which ethnicities call to denigration of women, belittling of women, and violence against the self or the same ethnicity in the same way that black communities do? I use that term, black on black crime, the knife crime, the gang culture in the UK, and the death rate from black people to black people. Why are we killing each other? Why are we denigrating black women? And we shall see very shortly some of the excellence, black excellence amongst black women. So we need to look inwardly. It is a time for introspection as well. We are not going to sit here and say, love you to the moon and black, and there's this nihilistic culture that is continued to be nurtured within our communities. at the behest of wider society, that have placed us in particular segments to continue doing that. Women, as we address men, we have to address the women of our communities. Which ethnicity denigrates and emasculates men to the extent that our women are doing that with Black men in their communities? And we need to change that around. When you look at the other cultures, when you look at the other ethnicities in how they cherish their mothers, the women of their family. So when you're denigrating a woman in your rap music, in your grime, in whatever genre you are in, you have a mother, you have a mother, you probably have sisters and aunties. Some of you may have daughters. And so we need to look at that. That's not loving of self, that's self-loathing, that's self-hate. We may be broken, but we are not beyond repair and rectification. And the intergenerational poverty and destructive tendencies that are being implemented upon us and which are being facilitated by us because it's a learned behavior can be reversed, can be rectified. And here again with Professor Andrews saying it is indisputable that the destruction of African culture was a primary process in maintaining slavery. Europeans did not just enslave us, they sought to break us in order to control us. And he went on, what does that look like? Central to being able to do so was to create the Negro, who had no civilization, no cultures, no religions, no histories, no place, and finally, no humanity that might command consideration. That was the overarching strategy that was implemented upon our forefathers. And we can see generationally the destructive nature, the destructive element of that. We need to reflect how we can change it, if not within ourselves, but within our children's lifetimes. And now moving to the other section of this episode, should I say. As has been done previously, I look at structural systemic racism on a macro level, and then I move to a more microcosmic level and look amongst communities, more predominant communities that are showing racism or displaying racism, practicing racism amongst minority Black communities that may be submerged or immersed with them or side by side with them. So researcher Kate Zuberi, in her work on British Muslim converts, she cites another researcher, Al-Qaidi, in which they interviewed an individual, a Black convert, and he stated as follows: white people are actually the least racist I've met, and people of color are the ones who have amazing amounts of racism in them. Asians, definitely. Arabs, definitely. And we need to ponder over this observation, because we've just been speaking about the psychosis of whiteness. We've been talking about structural and systemic racism in Western society, which is predominantly white-led, white-owned. However, this reality is one that needs to be acknowledged by these predominant Muslim communities. The racism that many of us experienced at the hands of white societies is not as severe and obvious as what we've experienced in converting to Islam and interacting with South Asian predominant communities, Arab predominant communities. The white racism is not as severe as what has been witnessed amongst our Muslim co-religionists. And that's a significant factor to take away with us. The interviewee acknowledged that this was largely among less practicing Muslims, but let's not fool ourselves. It also exists amongst more practicing elements as well. And I want to refer to some tweets that I saw and downloaded, highlighting the racism that is evident amongst the Arab communities to some extent. And there's a few tweets of a Sudanese individual being married to an Arab lady, and you can see they're both happy in their wedding attire, and the crowd and the families are there. And this is the screenshot that I took from the 13th of June. Quote, "This is a message to every shit N, the N word. Marry from your own people. Don't ever dream to marry a girl from us Arabs because you got money. Don't make our genes dirty." I'll repeat that. This is a message to every shit, I'll say the word nigger. Marry from your own people. And they litter out, they put N and then dot, 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 dot. To be fair to the person who tweeted this. Don't you ever dream to marry a girl from us Arabs because you've got money. Don't make our genes dirty. Let's not reflect upon the fact that among the Prophet ﷺ's wives was a black wife, Sauda. Let's not reflect upon the fact that a number of the close companions of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, were black. Let's not reflect upon what we discussed previously about the Muslims fleeing and doing their first mini pilgrimage or emigration to Abyssinia under the civilization of An-Najashi, the king there. All of this pales into insignificance with the racism that emanates from a small segment, I hope. I say I hope because many speak about other segments of Arab culture that has this embedded in them. Another tweet about this same marriage went as follows, and I'll read it exactly as it is. Seriously, girl, this is haram, forbidden. The Jahil, the ignorant man, died in a battle against the English colonizer. It is the end when a queen marries her slave. And I swear, if I was her father, I'd marry her myself instead of giving her to an N-word. I'd marry her myself. What he's actually saying is he would commit incest with his daughter instead of marrying her to an N-word. This is some deep racism. This is an intrinsic racism that comes from somewhere. It emanates from somewhere. It's been inherited from somewhere. And it's not from the dictates of Islam. That's for sure. What I'd like to do as we proceed through now, I'd like to go back in time. And I mentioned earlier on that we would speak about Black beauty. And this is a discovery, archaeological discovery in 2015, 15th of June, in northern Ethiopia to be exact. And I want to quote, you can Google this and it's there in the mainstream, but they found the remains of a woman from 2,000 years ago. And she was dubbed by the archaeologists who found her the Sleeping Beauty due to her features. And she was from the ancient kingdom of Axum, the ancient kingdom of Axum, dubbed Sleeping Beauty, 2,000 years on, which is an indication of how outstanding she must have been during her lifetime. And yet we get the racism from other minority communities, themselves minorities in wider Western societies. We get the nihilism and denigration from each other concerning the women of our communities and our ethnicities. But yet we have this Black beauty from Axum unearthed 2,000 years later in 2015. Again, staying Black in time. African Muslims were present in Brazil before Christopher Columbus. There's enough evidence, historic evidence, to prove that before slavery. And I'll read from here. And this is from Habib Akande's Illuminating the Blackness, another excellent book, researched thoroughly. Contrary to popular belief, the historical African connection to Brazil did not start with slavery. Africans traveled to Brazil hundreds of years before the Portuguese. And remember what I said in the first episode, that history, Black history, did not start with slavery. It was interrupted by it. Continuing with Habib's excerpt. The notion that Brazil's historical relations began with Portuguese explorer Pedro Alvares Cabral's discovery of it in 1500 is contested by historians and anthropologists who have found evidence of the presence of Africans in the Americas before the 16th century. The strongest evidence of the presence of Africans before Christopher Columbus comes from the pen of Christopher Columbus himself, because he noted in his journal, in conversations with Native Americans, that, quote, black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats, trading in gold-tipped spears, close quote. That was from the natives. Black-skinned people had come trading in gold-tipped spears, And researchers later found that these spears emanated from West Africa. North African Moors were also present in Brazil many years before others had so-called discovered it. And I don't want to talk about that because I've just referred to the evidence that Black Africans were in South America or in the Americas before Christopher Columbus, before the Italians, before the Europeans, not as slaves, but as tradesmen. So what I want to do is highlight who these Moors are as we draw to conclusion. And we see that the Moors were the medieval North African inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus, as it was known then, present-day Spain and Portugal. The term Moors is also used to refer to Muslims, particularly those of Berber and Arab descent, or to Black people, irrespective of their religion. So the Moors are credited with bringing Europe out of the Dark Ages by their contributions to European society and its educational system. Spain was ruled by the Moors for 800 years, and they had a lasting impact on Europe. The Black African presence of the Moors in Renaissance Europe is evident in the flag of the four Moors of the autonomous region of Sardinia, Italy. So there's this flag that has a depiction of four blindfolded Black characters. And it, basically that depicts the St. George's Cross with it, showing the conquest of Christianity over the Moors at that particular time. That's why they've retained the four heads, to show that they were victorious over these Black Moors, these North Africans. For those familiar with William Shakespeare and his story Othello, Othello was a Black Moor. And in the Shakespearean story, it shows the status, the high status and military rank of Othello. As I move to a conclusion, as I said, the Moors' occupation of the Iberian Peninsula began in 711 Christian era, when a Muslim army led by the North African Berber, Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. Gibraltar, the Arabic name for that is Jebel Tariq. It was named after this commander, Tariq ibn Ziyad. So when you look at the Rock of Gibraltar today, and you look at the origin of this name, it is Jebel Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. So he traveled with an army, and I want to read the account of this, and there's a lesson in this for us. There's a lesson of Black excellence in this: perseverance, strength, resolve, solidarity, commitment, faith. And we see here, Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the strait from northern Africa with his army of about 7,000 and embarked on the conquest of Spain, establishing the foundation for a kingdom that lasted nearly a millennium, as we said, 800 years. Facing an army of 100,000 upon landing, he ordered his ships burned, so his troops could not lose heart or flee. In a sermon to them before the Battle of Guadalete, he said, "O my warriors, where would you flee? Behind you is the sea, before you the enemy. You are left now with only the hope of your courage and your constancy," and obviously their faith, their strength of resolve and faith in their religion. But he said to them, they'd come from their homeland in North Africa to a new land. And he didn't say keep them anchored and have some of you stand guard in case we have to retreat. He ordered, burn the ships. Burn the ships. Instilling in the mind of his army that there was no returning back to that place, that comfortable place we call home. And I ask at this point, how can we incorporate this story from this point on, 2020? We need to burn that ship in our heart that is attaching us to something that is little more than a dream. Some are talking about repatriation to Africa. I'm not dismissing that, but I'm asking, how much of a reality is that to you when America is your home? You haven't known anywhere else. Forefathers were in bondage. So burn that emotional, psychological ship, because America is your home. Those of us in Europe, in the UK, who don't have that firm African connection, burn the ship, because the UK is where we are. And in front of us is a formidable landscape and a formidable enemy that is structural, that is systemic, that is alien. But we have an advantage in that we know that landscape and that terrain and that structure well. And we are still here today fighting, challenging, navigating through, across that structure and continuing to break down boundaries like our forefathers did all those centuries ago. So behind us, we have the sea, that turbulent sea in which many of our forefathers drowned, literally, middle passage, and metaphorically, with what they had to endure of the oppression. So we cannot go back there. That means we cannot adopt the strategies that they used then, because they're not applicable now. What we can carry forward, however, are the tools that they left with us of resilience, of resolve, of intelligence, of perseverance, because that's what will plow through the terrain that we're moving towards now. That's what will dismantle the structure that has been limiting our abilities. But again, that commitment and that faith in religion and that ultimate connection with that which transcends everything that is restricting us, with our Creator, with Allah, has to be that driving connection that we continue to hold on to very firmly. And as I've put down from some of the notes I've got here, retreat is easy when you have the option. Retreat is easy when you have the option, as I got from the notes here. There is no option. And the concluding words that I will have for us on this occasion embracing our suffering is key to our resisting it. Embracing our suffering and our forefathers' suffering is key to resisting it. We should not wallow in our pain or be consumed by it. We must use it as the driving force to push us into building a radical alternative. And remember, freedom is not a place. It is a state of being.